Imagine walking down a brightly lit grocery store aisle. The shelves are packed, and items move rapidly through the edges of your vision. Suddenly, the floor feels uneven, and the room starts to spin. Patients describe the sensation as a disorienting whirl triggered by the complex motion of the surrounding environment. This is visual flow. Yet, when that same patient visits a clinic for a diagnosis, they are often asked to close their eyes or are placed in total darkness. This occurs because the standard tool used in most clinics today is the Modified Clinical Test of Sensory Interaction on Balance, or the mCTSIB. The current clinical standard assesses dizziness by removing the exact visual environments where patients experience their most severe symptoms. The mCTSIB uses a four-part matrix: firm surface, eyes open; firm surface, eyes closed, then repeated on foam. In the final condition, foam removes foot feedback and closed eyes remove vision, forcing the body to rely entirely on the vestibular system. In clinical psychometrics, a test must possess ecological validity, the ability to predict a patient's performance in real-life situations. The mCTSIB fails this. People do not navigate their daily lives on unstable surfaces in the dark. Isolating the balance system in darkness only tests for the absence of a vestibular signal. It identifies gross vestibular loss, but ignores patients suffering from visual intolerance. Because it ignores visual conflict, the mCTSIB functions as a truncated fall risk screen rather than a true diagnostic test. The assessment was originally more robust. Horak and Shumway-Cook designed a comprehensive 6-condition tool that included conditions 3 and 6 to test true sensory conflict using a moving visual environment. In 1993, researcher Helen Cohen published a modification that removed those 2 conflict conditions, creating the 4-block matrix used today. This change addressed a hardware limitation. In the early 90s, the tool used to create visual conflict, a low-tech visual dome, failed to produce true postural torque. Because the specific tool was ineffective, the industry abandoned the test conditions entirely instead of improving the technology. Modern clinics now use a permanent diagnostic standard based on a 30-year-old hardware limitation. To understand proper balance diagnostics, we look to the established gold standard, Lou Naschner's Computerized Sensory Organization Test, or SOT. When researchers check a new test's concurrent validity, they compare it to the SOT. Unlike the modified screen, Naschner prioritized the conflict conditions that the mCTSIB removed. Naschner's innovation was the sway-referenced environment. When a patient swayed forward, a mechanical linkage caused the floor and visual wall to tilt in exact tandem. This is a closed-loop system. The environment's movement is entirely dependent on the participant's own physical motion. While groundbreaking in the 1980s, closed-loop systems are predictable. The brain learns the pattern, which prevents the hardware from inducing total sensory conflict. Modern virtual reality provides the technology to surpass Naschner's closed-loop model. VR goggles or immersive screens allow us to introduce true optokinetic flow, a continuous, randomized visual stimulus that moves independently of the patient. Here is the mechanical difference. On the left, the closed-loop environment moves only when the patient moves. On the right, the open-loop VR system moves independently. Because the VR environment moves randomly, the brain cannot predict or sync it to body movement. This forces sensory reweighting. The brain must recognize that the visual data is unreliable and shift to vestibular data to maintain posture. Open-loop optokinetic flow creates a sensory conflict far more intense than a closed-loop system, forcing the brain to adapt immediately or fail the test. Most dizzy patients do not present with total vestibular loss. Instead, they develop a pathological dependency on their vision. Restoring visual conflict conditions with VR provides the specificity needed to identify these subtle disorders. It allows a clinician to differentiate between the visually dependent patient, who relies on vision to remain upright, and the visually overwhelmed patient, who performs better in total darkness. Postural stability relies on the brain's ability to adjust the importance of competing sensory inputs. If a clinician does not test sensory conflict, they are ignoring the brain's data processing mechanics. The mCTSIB reliably spots major falls, but it fails to track how patients recover from visual dependency. Clinicians require provocative reliability, the ability to measure meaningful clinical change against escalating levels of sensory conflict. Initially, a rehab patient might lose balance under low levels of visual flow. Over weeks of targeted exercise, as the intensity increases, the trend lines track their building tolerance. Clinical research shows that exposing patients to visual flow is a superior starting point for rehabilitation compared to repeatedly practicing static balance in the dark. A robust diagnostic test maps the patient's dynamic pathway to recovery, providing data that guides the entire course of clinical improvement, rather than simply recording a static deficit. Integrating VR into the full CTSIB bridges the gap between Horac's original design and modern capability. Testing dizzy patients exclusively in the dark means missing half of the pathology. Specialists now possess the open-loop technology to perform complete diagnostic assessments. It is time to stop settling for a simplified screen.